ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to our annual Pacific Northwest NABat acoustic monitoring training. I'm Beth Ward. I'm the Northwest Bat Hub coordinator for those of you who don't know me. I've been with the Bat Hub for about 1.5 years now, and I'm excited to present to you on all of the granular details of detector siting and placement. And actually, I've got a little agenda here. So I will be talking about NABat and acoustic detector siting, placement, programming. Sarah will talk a little bit about how to program Pettersson D500X detectors. And then I will talk a little bit about our field maps application and data collection form. And then Sarah will finish things up with talking about the Audible Bats protocol. And then we can follow up with a Q&A at the end. And we have a lot of content to talk about, so I'll try and kind of keep us on pace. And I know for many of you, this will be just kind of a review if you've done these trainings in the past. We don't have a bunch of wildly new content to share other than there are some firmware updates to D500X detectors as well as the SM4 wildlife acoustics detectors. Also, we'll mention changing the internal batteries in your D500X detectors. We had quite a few of them stop working last year. They ran out of battery and caused some issues with the detectors. So this year we're just recommending that everyone go ahead and change their internal batteries. And then yeah, there might be a couple updates to the Audible Bats protocol, but other than that, hopefully this will be a review for most of you, and those of you who haven't deployed for NABat before, this will all be new content and help you better understand how to place your detectors in a way so that we're collecting the best data possible. So I think, it's important to remember why we're conducting bat monitoring. You've likely heard of white nose syndrome, which has been detrimental to bat populations in the United States, as well as, wind turbine related fatalities. And as development of wind facilities continues to gain momentum, it's important that we know what's happening with bat population status and trends. So, what do we know? We know that bats are incredibly difficult to monitor. This was thoroughly documented in this 2003 USGS technical report. So bats are difficult to monitor, and this results in major gaps in understanding on, where bats are, how many of them are there, where and how far do they move, how do they respond to stressors or different types of management actions, and how does this differ among species? So many of you are familiar with the North American Bat Monitoring Program, or NABat, but I think I'll just run through briefly. It's important to understand the aims of NABat, and those include increasing quantity and quality of available data on North American bats and making data accessible for addressing bat conservation problems and management needs, and using these data to provide regular updates on species status and trends. And so NABat accomplishes those objectives by leaning on 3 key pillars: protocols that are consistent yet flexible, and we have a Pacific Northwest protocol that we'll be distributing to everyone. A probabilistic sampling approach by having a unifying sampling design, and having multiple survey types for a weight of evidence in integrated data analysis. So all of these tools enable sampling across the entire continent, and it accounts for imperfect detections and fills local and range-wide information needs for effectively managing our bat populations. And so NABat uses a number of survey methods to facilitate bat monitoring across North America. Those methods are internal colony counts, external colony counts, or emergence counts, acoustic surveys using stationary detectors and mobile transects. We'll be talking mostly about stationary acoustic monitoring for this particular training, and then also capture records. So by looking at multiple status variables, which are informed by multiple data streams, we can see a more complete picture of where North American bats occur and in what numbers and how these metrics change over time. So the way the NABat sampling design is set is by following this GRITS order, generalized random tessellation stratified order, which is a probabilistic sampling approach that ensures subsets are spatially balanced and unbiased. So within each of these grid cells, you can conduct, the monitoring methods that I mentioned in the previous slide, or in this case, you can conduct acoustic monitoring within each one of these sample units, following that randomized selection of sample units. And so just real quick, what can we learn from NABat? There's a lot that we can learn from it, and there's a lot that we can do with the NABat framework. But leveraging this weight of an evidence-based approach, NABat can produce estimates of, summer occupancy, so where bats occur across the summer landscape and how this changes over time. This is what we are doing with these stationary acoustic surveys that we'll be talking about here in a second. You can also estimate summer abundance and winter abundance. And NABat does produce status and trends products and those can be accessed via their website. And so some of these products include peer-reviewed manuscripts and reports, high-resolution maps, and summarized results. And they'll continue to conduct updated analyses as more data becomes available and as statistical methods continue to evolve and advance. So now that you have a little bit of a background there on NABat, I'll go ahead and talk about our sampling protocol. So we're going to go over the main objectives we're trying to accomplish as we conduct these acoustic bat surveys. So we should keep these objectives in mind as we go through the training today, especially when we talk about site selection and detector deployment. The objectives being to detect as many species as possible that are expected within the sample unit by targeting habitats that support multiple species and sites that contain as much landscape heterogeneity as possible across the entire sample unit. We want to conduct surveys where it's practical and effective and accessible. And it is important to resurvey the same sample units in order to contribute to the long-term monitoring effort. So the basic protocol is to deploy 4 detectors within a 10 by 10 kilometer sample unit for one night here in the Pacific Northwest. In other regions, they might deploy for 4 nights, and we have kind of tried to capture this larger spread effort by making it more accessible by sampling for one night. So you can split a sample unit into 4 quadrants. You can kind of see that light blue box in one of the images here and how it's split into 4 different quadrants, and you place 1 detector in each quadrant when possible. And if it's not possible, just ensure detectors are deployed at least 1.5 kilometers from each other to create a different site. Just absolutely make sure that you're in the boundaries. All land in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho is broken into this 10 by 10 kilometer grid system. So if you're outside the boundary of a targeted sample unit, then you're in another untargeted sample unit. So just make sure you're right in the correct, sample unit that you're wanting to survey. And here's just a general sampling schedule that we've come up with in order to help ensure that the more arid sites in the east or in the south in Idaho have a greater probability of having more water available earlier in the season, so that you can record bats that are more likely to be moving on the landscape in those environments. So for Oregon and Washington, this takes on an east to west approach for timing of your surveys, and for Idaho, from south to north. Okay, now I'm going to get into site selection. So when starting, from your office, if you will, and reviewing the sample unit for sites to place your detectors, it's important to look for landscapes that appear to have good variability or heterogeneity, and native vegetation. Capturing this complexity, the landscape complexity or habitat complexity, will increase the probability of documenting bats and many more species of bats. So try to target areas where bats are roosting or commuting and feeding and drinking. And I'll kind of get into how to assess all of those things a little bit more here. But as I mentioned, generally more habitat diversity equals more species and numbers of those species. So consider areas that look like these and these, the particular photos that I'm showing here, where you have water sources with roosting structures such as cliffs and trees, or forest edge habitat with a water source. In general, these can be, really productive sites. And in contrast, habitat with less diversity, or that is more homogeneous, you can likely expect fewer species. Yet, if this is all you have within your sample unit, then still set up a detector in these areas, as data from these areas is still invaluable to the project. Because it's good to know what bat species are using these areas, and we don't want to just sample in areas where we always expect bats to occur. So here are a few terms you'll hear us using today in regards to site selection. Detection target is an important one. Detection target is the landscape feature of interest at which to record acoustic bat activity, or where bats are going to localize. So, an example of a detection target would be a pond or a forest edge. Or a trail, a commuting trail. Physical clutter is the density of obstacles in the flight environment. So examples of physical clutter are vegetation, water surfaces, which I'll get into a little more here, cliff faces. Clutter affects the quality of calls and can mask bat calls and their call characteristics. So it's important to know just how much clutter was at your site, because that can often help kind of determine species ID, or you want less clutter so that you can collect clear search phase calls. And then acoustic clutter. So that's, more unpredictable sources, such as, a non-stationary object or sound like insect noise or wind. So those are just a couple of important terms. And so when possible, detectors should be placed to monitor bats in a variety of habitats to maximize the diversity of species likely to be detected. And in this schematic example, each detector would be placed such that they sample different habitat features that may occur in each of the quadrants in the sample unit. So this, helps to reach our objectives of maximizing number of species that are likely to be detected. Some species may be prone to using one feature over another. So, you can kind of, again, see in the schematic, the little rectangles that are filled in. You've got one in the northwest quadrant that's sampling that sort of little forested opening. In the northeast quadrant, it's sampling this stream. In the southwest, sampling a pond, and then southeast, sampling what appears to be like a, drawn trail or road corridor. And so water is an important detection target. Not all water sources are created equal, so faster water is not going to work quite as well. Flat water sources make more ideal detection targets, as bats are more likely to come and drink from them. And so while bats might use fast water sources as like a commuting corridor, fast water will trigger the detector and potentially create, noise files, which will in turn eat up your memory or batteries. So you want to look for those nice flat water sources if possible. And then if you're looking at a large water source like this one here on the left, you want to be able to find kind of a smaller water source, like a stream that feeds into that type of lake, in order to target areas of localization. So you want to try to find where bats will be more confined as they commute to this type of area. Bats will also use natural and engineered water sources. So, these make good sites and typically still have some good open water. And they, also will use man-made water sources and environments such as a sewage pond or a fish hatchery or a golf course. Those are all good water sources for bats. And then also where water is a limiting factor, like out in the high desert, they'll drink from the smallest water sources. So these guzzlers and troughs are important sources for them. And then in more mesic, wetter habitats that are typically more forested, it can be tricky to find good spots for detector placement. So, look for forest openings or breaks in the habitat. Something like the photo here looks like it would be a great spot for bat activity, but it's not a great spot for an acoustic detector. Because you've got these rock walls. It's challenging to get away from the source of clutter in this photo and this type of environment. Those rock walls will create echoes, and bat activity, might be more up in the canopy potentially. This would be a great site for mist netting potentially, but not as good for acoustic equipment. In these types of tight, narrow areas, you might have to do a little bit of engineering to create a clear path for your microphone. I will point out too, like, you really don't want to be lashing your detector to a tree where it can be positioned in a heavily cluttered environment. And so different age stands can provide a different diversity of insects. And there's also more structural diversity in the older stands. And then edge habitats can provide good insect diversity and bat diversity. And then also create enough of an open area so you can collect those clear search phase bat calls. And in these sort of the forest shrub steppe ecotone, you have these dry riverine type areas that may not have water in them anymore, but they make good travel corridors. And there's often a lot of insect activity observed in these types of areas. So those can make good sites. And then, of course, edge habitat, again, good for foraging. And there's enough of an open area to provide opportunities to record good quality calls away from clutter. And then same here, open areas contain edge habitat, thus again, increased insect and bat diversity and allow for clear, high-quality calls. You can look for these larger forest openings like the ones that we have pictured here. These are all, I'm kind of just going through lots of example photos to give you an idea of what some of your sites could look like, and where detectors could be appropriately placed. So you can see the different detector setups in these photos. You know, some of the higher elevation sites, you might have less diversity of bats. So you want to be targeting the water systems and edges in these kind of high elevation meadows. And then, you know, you often see bats flying down these roadways or a stream corridor, which they'll be using for commuting and for foraging. So trails, roads, streams are good sites. I typically don't recommend that folks place detectors along paved roads. You know, usually that means they're a little bit of a busier road. So, you know, look for those kind of more dirt and gravel access road type roads, secondary roads. In addition to water in drier forests, you can also look for potential roosting habitat like snags that have exfoliating bark or cracks or crevices. You can look for areas that have more than one good roost site. So like in some of these photos here, you've got multiple snags. So those might be sites that are worth trying. And forests with vertical structure and dead or dying wood offer more opportunities for roosting and foraging. And when fine-tuning your detector placement in these kinds of environments, especially if you're using roosts as a detection target, you know, you want to, again, yeah, look for large hollow trees or snags where bats could be roosting with exfoliating bark, or, you know, the snags pictured here could contain maternity colonies or multiple bats that might be inhabiting the roost. But it's not recommended that you focus on just one tree or place your detector close to the tree. You want to place it back within this kind of environment when you're targeting a particular roost. It can kind of create a chaotic call call quality and detections if you place a microphone too close to a roost. So you can use this roost as a detection target, but offset it in this opening so that you're not pointing the microphone directly at the roost, but you're still capturing the bat activity in that general area, still using that as a detection target. And then you can also target other types of roosting sites like caves or rock features, like these talus slopes, like the one pictured here, you know, lava flows and crevices. Again, you know, you're wanting to set your detector offset from these roosts, but still targeting the general area. And then also old buildings serve as great roosting habitat. So you can certainly use these types of detection targets in an open landscape where there's not, you know, a better feature option. Also, bridges provide possible roosting habitat, and there's often really good diversity at these sites because they contain a water source and a roosting structure. So you'll often encounter habitats like these, especially in the east side of Oregon and Washington and southern Idaho. But you know, don't get discouraged. It might look like there's low diversity or not any good or ideal detection targets. But if you look a little closer, you might discover that there is some habitat for roosting or maybe a dry water feature or a travel corridor. or maybe some clumps of denser vegetation that might serve as good foraging areas. So you could still use those as detection targets, even when the landscape seems really homogeneous and like there's not any clear detection target. But just look a little closer and you might find something that sticks out. And then if there's no suitable bat habitat, set up your detector somewhere in the sample unit, because foresights are still needed, and that absence data is beneficial. Okay, a little more on detector placement. It's maybe one of the most important aspects of collecting good quality acoustic data. So to restate our goal, we want to be able to collect clear distinguishing calls of expected species in the area. So I already showed you most of this slide, but I just want to restate the definition of clutter and other interference. So, try to avoid placing the detector, or more importantly, the microphone, near things such as vegetation or sources of physical clutter. You want to stay away from busy roads, like I mentioned in a couple of slides ago, so that you can avoid picking up sounds of vehicles. These are all things that may mask bat calls. And a general rule of thumb is that your detectors should be placed 10 to 15 feet away from sources of clutter. And what we're looking for here are these nice, clear search phase calls, which have the most species-specific call characteristics and allow us to have a more confident identification of the bat species. So poor quality calls prevent the ability to confidently identify species presence. And you can see in this slide kind of the difference of what it looks like in NABat between a good, clear search phase call that's been recorded and a more poorly recorded call that has a bunch of noise or maybe clutter attached to it. So here's an example of what a good detector site placement looks like and the types of clear search phase calls that this type of site can produce. And in turn, here's an example where detectors are placed in clutter, thus producing calls that are not particularly clear. The clutter masks the call characteristics needed for species ID. So you can see in these photos here, the detector's just placed way too far, way too close to the tree in the one. And then in the second photo, the microphone is just kind of up in all of these small branches. So those are making it challenging to actually collect clear looking calls. And it's important to get the detector mic up high enough to avoid water surface echoes. So you can see in this diagram how the call shows an echo from the bat call hitting the surface of the water and then reverberating up to the microphone, which creates a degraded signal. We want that bat call to be going directly into the microphone. So in general, placing your detector, away from the edge of the water source is recommended. And as bats are approaching clutter, they alter the structure of their echolocation calls to be able to gather more information about their environment. So when this happens, call characteristics become less species specific. So again, I can't reiterate enough, we're looking for those high quality search phase calls, which are typically collected in more open, less cluttered environments. I also would recommend placing detectors where they're less visible from the general public. Okay, looks like I'm, yeah, reiterating that detectors should be placed, 10 to 16 feet in any direction away from sources of clutter or from the detection targets. Um, and that includes the microphone. So if you're, looking outward horizontally and everything looks clear, that's great. But also don't forget that your microphone is above you when you're placing it. So, pay attention to what's immediately in what sources of clutter are potentially above you, like an overhanging branch, um, or, is there like a overhanging rock wall above you that you're not taking into account? Um, it might not always be possible to place it fully, 10 to 15 feet away from clutter. You might be a little bit closer because that's your only option, and that's okay, but do your best to try and orient the microphone to the most open space. Okay, and then kind of to reiterate again, this is some further guidance for placing detectors near known roost sites or suspected roost sites. At a survey location, you would follow this general guidance of 5 to 10 meters for smaller roost trees, and then 15 to 30 meters away from large roosts. And I'll just cruise through some example photos here to give you a better idea of what some good sites look like. So in this photo, assuming bats are roosting back in this forested rocky area, you can place the detector mic perpendicular to the water source or elevate the detector upslope, like the schematic shows, placing it upslope there to get a better orientation. So this water source has a tree line along the far edge. You can place the detector oriented up and away along the tree line edge and facing the water where bats might be coming in to forage or drink. So yeah, kind of just showing the detector elevated and offset from the water source. Here's an example of a good detector placement showing the detector offset from the water source, which is serving as the detection target in this case. Another good example here, looks like a pond is being used as a detection target, and the detector is offset. Here are some detectors that are targeting some small water sources in a more arid landscape. Again, bats love these cattle troughs or guzzlers. And so the detector is placed set back from the water source in order to record, good quality calls. And this site, they did a good job of camouflaging the detector by painting the pole beige to blend in with the landscape. It's maybe a little close to the water here, but you can kind of see this little schematic moved the detector placement a little bit further up the hillside. But this is still a good site. Here's an example of a detector targeting a really nice water source, but the photo makes it look like the microphone is oriented right into those overhanging branches. So it's a good example of where you should look for a more open spot, or maybe tie those branches back so that the microphone has a more clearer, excuse me, a more clearer open spot. Here's a good example of protecting the detector against cattle, which love to come and knock over your pole and or like rub against it. So you do have to take some precautionary measures when setting up detectors in areas where there's a lot of cattle. In these examples, it looks like they've created a little barrier around the one detector, a fencing so that the cows can't get to the detector. And in this other photo, the detector is mounted to a rock basket, which serves as a good way to secure the detector if cows are present. The site, just showing some examples of the detector being, offset from vegetation. The mic is set perpendicular to the travel corridor. And in tighter road corridors like the one on the right, you might just need to angle the microphone in a way that it's following the road corridor a little bit more, so that you can offset it from the clutter along the edge. And here's a few more good site photos along forest edges. So again, detectors are set away from the edge, but they're still using that forest edge as the detection target. And then here's some example of some rock features that you can use as targets. This one is an example of a microphone that's placed way too close to a rock wall. That will create echoes. So again, you want to offset that like 15 feet away from that rock wall, at least. Some more examples from previous survey efforts. This detector was placed up high where bats are flying through this ravine and foraging near rocky areas. This was a great spot. It detected 7 species. And then getting more into cluttered habitat does become more difficult, but you can focus your microphone in the direction of the more open corridor. You just do the best you can with what you've got. Here's an example of kind of a tricky site. Do what you can to avoid having the mic right over the water or near vegetation, and still target the corridor as bats are moving in and out of this water source. You could always raise the mic a little higher. And actually, even in the example of a few slides ago where I was showing the microphone pointing into some branches, but targeting a nice water source, you could always set that pole that the microphone's mounted on a little bit further down the slope. If there's no other opening to that water source, then you don't want to take out some of the branches above you. So these are examples of some more cluttered locations. You can always tie back the vegetation, like I mentioned, in order to get clear space around the microphone. You just always want to be looking for that clearer opening. So in summary, the main things to take away from this are, place your survey locations, your detector sites where bats are going to be commuting, feeding, or drinking. You want to raise the mic at least 3 meters or 10 feet off the ground. You want to point the mic away from sources of bounce or echo, such as rock walls and large water bodies. And you want to point the mic away from sources of noise or acoustic clutter, such as fast water and cars, power lines, etc. Okay, taking good photos is very important, and these will be uploaded to our field maps data form, which I'll go through a little more later. But just some guidance here. You want to take good photos that encompass the detection target and the detector setup. This helps us determine species ID in some cases, to be able to look at that habitat and detector location and link it with the call data is important. So in general, we say, take one photo, include the detector and the detection target. And, here's an example of a few other good photos where you kind of had to in this one on the right, had to kind of jump to the other side of the stream bank in order to capture what was around the detector. Another good photo example of a site showing detection target and detector. And then if you can only get the detector in the photo because it's a more cluttered environment or the perspective isn't very good, then just take two photos, a photo of your detection target and the habitat surrounding it, and then a photo of your detector placement. And here's just an example of detection target only photos. Just do your best. Okay, I'm going to go through assessing clutter now, which you'll need to do and enter into the field maps data form, which again, I'll get into more later. But taking clutter into account is really important because it helps us with species ID and call quality. Excuse me. So, okay, the process for assessing clutter. So standing next to your detector setup, you want to visually observe the volume of physical clutter in a 50-meter hemispheric space as best as possible. If topography like a hillside hinders your view, there's no need to walk up and see what's on the other side of the hill. Just include the hill in your assessment of clutter. And be sure to consider all physical objects, so vegetation, rocks, human-made structures in your estimation. Here's a good schematic showing that 50-meter hemispheric radius, the detector, and you'll see in the data form that there will be these different clutter categories that you can record. So 0 means there's no structural interference. 1 is 1 to 25% clutter, 2, 26 to 50% clutter, 3 is 51 to 75% clutter, and then 4 is 76 to 100% clutter. And you'll also have to assess the clutter type. So in the data form, you'll circle the most prominent type of clutter. Many times this is just it's vegetation or maybe a hillside or a rock face. And you can also circle other significant types of clutter. And okay, yeah, I've got some photos here just to serve as examples when assessing clutter. Here's a totally open landscape. There's no vegetation or rocks that are obstructing that detector site. So category of 0 is fairly obvious there. This is approximately a 1 to 25% clutter, so not a whole lot going on, maybe a couple of trees or some rock piles that are in the general area. Clutter category 2, 25 to 50%. So you're seeing some more vertical structure here, vertical vegetation in the way. 51 to 75%. Again, a higher density of trees and shrubs in the area. And then 76 to 100% clutter in these tighter corridors in wooded areas. Again, sometimes unavoidable. You just have to do the best that you can to orient the microphone well so that it's not obscured by surrounding branches. Okay, so I know that you all are using different types of detectors. Our field crews use the Pettersson D500Xs, and I know many of you use those as well. I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the equipment that we use here at the Bat Hub and how we deploy our detectors. You all likely deploy in a similar fashion, even if it is an SM4 or one of the SM mini bats. But we, have our detector And we've got a microphone and a microphone cable, and we've created these mic capsules out of PVC to keep the microphone protected while not in use. And then batteries and a storage box to help with weatherproofing the detectors. And this is how we set them up. We mount that microphone on a painter's pole, which is extended to 10 feet. And we pound some rebar in the ground and then put the painter's pole over top, wrap that microphone cable around the painter's pole and connect it to the detector. Just a few example photos of our detector setups. I'll just go over these steps really quickly. Again, this is oriented towards folks who are using the Pettersson D500Xs. But yeah, again, you pound your rebar in with a mallet and attach the PVC T-joining to one end of your pole, the painter's pole, and then insert the microphone into the capsule as these photos are showing here. And then attach your microphone cable to the microphone, and then insert the mic into the mic capsule so that that microphone element protrudes from the capsule. So you can see the little microphone hone that's sticking out of the end of that PVC capsule. So yeah, connecting my cable detector, and then place your detector inside of some kind of box or, weatherproofing, which is important. You want to be gentle with Pettersson D500Xs. They can be kind of finicky and delicate. So we try to treat them with care. I know I don't need to go into that too much with you all, but anyway. We try to take good care of our microphone cables. That's often the source of some kind of malfunction, is if your microphone cable over time gets sort of kinked or causes issues, and you won't get good recordings. And then we typically secure ours with a lock so that folks can't go in and steal the detector. As a general rule, you want to be sure that you're deploying at least an hour before local sunset time, and then leaving that detector up for one night to record, and then retrieving the next day when possible. If it rains for more than half the night, then you might want to leave the detector out for a second night so that you can get a fuller night of recording. Okay, I think that wraps it up for me for now. So I'm going to pass this over to Sarah Rose, who's going to give a quick run through of the operation and settings of D500X detectors, the Pettersson D500X detectors. And just as a reminder, all of this information is contained within the field manual, which I'll be distributing after our training. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then Sarah, if you want to go through the programming.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. All right. Can everybody see that? Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
Looks good.
Excellent. Okay. Get myself situated. Okay, so this is going to be kind of a basic run through of how to operate these Petterssons, and then we'll go over very briefly firmware updates and changing the internal batteries. If you happen to have a Pettersson with you right now, feel free to kind of go along with me, but I will be going kind of fast. So, and this is all going to be recorded and put on our YouTube channel later, so you can always refer back to this video. Okay. Oh, we want to advance? There we go. Yeah, as Beth mentioned, we have our field manual that we'll be distributing. It's a very good idea to keep that with you in the field, especially if you don't set these up very often. It can be hard if you're only doing 1 or 2 sample units a year to remember, like, oh, shoot, how did I fix this problem last year? In addition to the field manual, we also created these in-box cheat sheets. So we now keep a laminated copy of these taped to the inside of our detector boxes, and it's been really effective for preventing some of the more common mistakes with the Petterssons. It has some of the basic settings on there, and then the proper way to set it to record and also shut it down, which we'll be going into detail in just a moment. So the first step is to install the batteries. So the battery compartment is on the top of the detector. You open it by just unscrewing. You're going to put in 4 C batteries. We do rechargeable batteries here at the Bat Hub. Non-rechargeables are fine as well. And with the older detectors, the springs aren't quite as springy as we would like, and so sometimes they don't push the battery terminals all the way into place. So what I like to do, even with newer detectors, is when I put my batteries in, I kind of place my thumbs on top of them and push the batteries towards the positive ends of that little battery harness, just to make sure that we're making good contact. I've had a number of situations where I just pop my battery in and then like I tilt the detector a little bit, and those batteries that lose contact with the harness. So you just want to make sure that everything's nice and tight in there, and that you're getting a good detection or connection. There we go. And then one more note on batteries. Those harnesses are only attached to the inside of the detector by a little cable. So you want to just be careful once you've got those 4 very heavy C batteries in that harness. If you were to like just let that dangle free, it could actually rip those wires from the inside of the detector. And that's a very difficult problem to fix, especially in the field. So just be gentle. As soon as you've got your batteries in there and situated, go ahead and slide that back in. Never let the battery case dangle. If you need to, for whatever reason, you can kind of unsnap it from those wires and do whatever you need to do. But that's a pretty rare instance. After you've got your batteries in, you want to install your CF cards. We're going to remove the bottom cover of the detector. I like to call it the detector's pants, just because it's fun and a little faster. Anyways, so once the pants are off, the bottom of your detector should look like this. And the CF cards do need to go in a particular order. So slot 1 on the upper left and slot 2 on the lower left are the ones that most of you will be using. You want to have at least 32 gigs of memory in the detector for a single night of recording, and the cards generally come in 32 or 16 gigs. So you're going to have 1 or 2 cards per detector. But if you have a particularly noisy site that you can't relocate, you may want to put in an extra card. I do this a lot at really windy locations where there's, relocating isn't going to do you any good anyways. Yeah, so I like to have probably 48 gigs in windy areas. There's a little lip on each CF card, and when you install them, you want to make sure that that little lip is facing down. The cards don't click into place, but they do hold firm, so it's pretty obvious when they're installed correctly. And once they're in, you can go ahead and flip the power switch to INT for internal power. And your detector is going to wake up. Once it's done, the screen is going to look something like this. And for the first deployment of the season, you really should check all of your detector settings. I like to do this both in the office before I head into the field, and then again when I'm setting up the detector for the first time in the field. And that's partly because we are managing a lot of detectors here, so it can be easy to lose track of which ones you've checked and which ones you haven't, but it's just generally good practice because an incorrect setting can mess up all of your recordings. So the first setting we're going to check is the user profile. We always use user 0, and you may have noticed on the last screen that that's what it said at the top. So to access the user settings, we're going to hit F1 to bring us to the ready screen, and then F1 again to bring us to our setting options. Make sure the user profile is highlighted and then press enter. Double check that these settings are correct. If anything needs to be changed, you can press enter and then use the up and down and left, right arrows to navigate between settings and change them. As a rule across the board, whenever you're changing a setting in a Pettersson detector, you need to hit enter to save that change setting. If you hit escape to go back to the previous screen, your changes will not be saved. From here, we're going to go to our recording settings, and we just want to make sure that we have a gain of 45, trigger level of 0, or no, sorry, trigger of 160 and interval of 0. If all is well, hit escape. If you need to change any of these, again, your arrows are going to be how you do that, and you hit enter to change your changes. There we go. Now we're going to go down to timers, and this is where things get a little bit less intuitive. Once you select the timer settings, you'll see up to 4 options. If you haven't updated your firmware in a couple of years, then you might not see all of these options yet. But everyone's going to update their firmware this year. So once you've done that, you'll see all 4 of these settings. For this project, we use absolute timers. So we're going to select that, hit enter, and that'll bring us to our absolute timers screen. And if all you see are dashed lines across all of your A timers, then you need to press the power button, oddly enough, to turn A timer 1 on. And then you're going to hit enter to get over to those times and use the up-down arrows to change the times so that your detector is turning on at 1930 and off at 6:30. And then what we're going to want to do after that, after we've hit enter again to save our changes, we're going to go down to relative timers and make sure that those are off. So your relative timer should just show dashes. If it shows a time, just go ahead and press the power button to turn that off and then enter to save that change. Delayed start is pretty simple. We'll scroll down to that, hit enter, and just make sure that it reads 0000. That is the default, so everyone's detector should already be set to that. And then we'll scroll down to auto arm. Auto arm is a feature that came out with the most recent firmware update, and it's kind of a fail-safe to make sure that the detector is definitely going to turn on and start recording. So we want to make sure that that is on, and its default is set to off. So most of you will need to change that if you haven't in the past. We're going to return to our settings menu. If you are on the timer screen, you can hit escape. If you ended up on the ready screen, just hit F1 again, scroll down to time settings, and then you're going to use the arrows to navigate between the time settings and just change them. And you just want to make sure that you're showing the correct date and time. You don't need to worry about the zone or coordinates. Those only impact the recording if you're using relative timers, which again, we are not. Once we've hit enter to save our time change, we should be returned to the home screen. And this is when we want to do a quick once over to make sure that everything looks correct. So we'll see the date and the time, that user 0 at the top. Everything looks good. And now it's time to plug in our microphone. So the microphone gets plugged into the top of the detector and on the larger of the 2 plugs up there. It's a 5-pin audio cable that's used, and it does kind of click into place. In some of the older detectors, you don't really get that audible click, but you can kind of see in the image here, there's that little button. So it should snap into place and hold, which is good. You want to make sure you're aligning your pins correctly. It's pretty easy to accidentally push pins in. So while you do need to push firmly, you do want to make sure everything's aligned nicely before you give it that firm push. And as Beth mentioned, these cables can be a big source of issues with the detectors. They get kinked, or they get yanked on a little too hard and become frayed at the ends. And so one of our common troubleshooting steps is to figure out if we're having issues with our microphone or our cable, if we're not picking up sound. So one thing that I just like to make sure people are aware of is that you can detach the microphone from the microphone cable and plug it directly into the detector. It's a really good way to figure out which piece of equipment is failing you in a given moment. And the way that you check if you are getting sound is to just stay on that ready screen and make some noise. And your decibel bar should jump as you make noise. You want to make some sort of noise that has maybe an ultrasonic kind of undertone to it. So snapping your fingers, jingling keys, that sort of thing. I don't like to use talking just because, some people have lower voices. So something that's going to kind of have those higher frequency undertones to it is good. And this is kind of what you want to see when you're looking for sound. If it's not jumping or not jumping very much as you're making those noises, then it's time to do some additional troubleshooting. Okay, setting the detector to record. This is probably our most important step, but it's luckily a very simple one. From the home screen, you're going to hit the record button. It should show you your recording settings. And then from there, you're just going to hit enter, and it will begin a countdown that will show you some of your basic settings. And then it's going to go to sleep. And an additional step, just to make sure that your detector is actually set to record, after it's gone to sleep, you can tap the power button and it'll wake up briefly and again show you all those settings, when it's going to turn on, off, and it should say wake up waiting, unless you're testing it after 7:30 p.m. and then it's going to say wake up armed, and that means it's already in recording mode. So stopping a recording session, you're going to press the power button, and then once, that'll wake up the detector a little bit, and then you're going to press and hold the power button until the ready screen appears. Take a quick glance, make sure everything looks good, and then you're going to go ahead and power down your detector before you flip the switch on the bottom. This is really important. If you just wake up your detector or don't wake it up and you just flip the switch, you could corrupt the files that are on those CF cards. And while sometimes those files can be recovered, it is an incredibly slow process. It's really hit or miss, and it just means that you've wasted a lot of time and effort, which none of us want to do. Our time is valuable, so make sure that you are shutting down the detector correctly. From that ready screen, you're going to press and hold the power button and release, and then it'll prompt you to press enter to shut the detector down, and then you can go ahead and flip that switch. Okay, so that's the basics of setting up and powering down your detector. Firmware updates. These are also incredibly important. There are some older firmware versions that are very glitchy. And I would say that there are pretty big improvements when Pettersson comes out with firmware upgrades. So that our auto arm feature is one in particular that has really cut down on user error. So you do want to make sure that you are up to date on your firmware. Those instructions are on the Pettersson website. They're pretty straightforward. You need to install a D500X utility program, which is available on their website. Use that to put the firmware update onto a CF card, and then you pop the CF card into your detector and turn it on and just follow the prompts on the detector. The one tricky thing to note is that different detectors are on different firmware versions right now. So if you've got a detector that's more than a few years old, you're probably going to be upgrading to firmware version 2.3.8. If you have one of the newer ones that has a serial number above 52248, then you're going to be on firmware version 2.4.5. Yeah, okay, that's all I have for firmware updates. They're pretty straightforward, and if you are concerned or in a hurry and you don't have a bunch of time to do this in the office, like I know we have a lot of people who are kind of sharing detectors and they're on a bit of a time crunch, go ahead and just before you even get your detectors, put that firmware version on a CF card and bring it with you into the field. It only takes a few minutes to update your firmware once you've got it on that CF card. Yeah, so changing the internal battery, all of the Pettersson detectors have a small like disk battery inside them that keeps the date and the time when there aren't C batteries in the detector. So it's really obvious when your battery has run out of juice because the time and date will automatically set to New Year's Day, year 2000. Um, and so we recommend replacing your internal battery before you get to this point. Um, we had our detectors for about 6 years before almost all of them had their internal batteries run out over the course of a couple of months. So it's just a good idea if you've had your detectors for a few years to go ahead and swap those out. It's not something that's as easy to do in the field. So you want to do that in the office whenever possible. The first step is going to be to take off the detector's pants, just like we usually do. And then you're going to have to use a small star-shaped screwdriver to undo the 4 screws in the corners. And you'll take that bottom plate off. As you can see, that plate is attached to the inside of the detector, again, through some very thin wires. So you just want to be careful when you do that, that you're not tugging too hard on anything. You know, we at the Bat Hub treat our detectors like infants because they are delicate. Once you've got it open, you're actually going to want to flip it over, or pull the whole circuit board out a little bit and flip it over, and that will expose that C2032 battery. It's a little disc battery. It is very tight in there, so I do use pliers to pull it out. Um, Pretty simple process once you've got the detector open. And then you'll just go ahead and put a fresh one in there. Um, and then once you've done that and you've put it all back together, you know, you need to go ahead and change your time and date back to what is appropriate. Yeah, and that's all I have for detector operation.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
Sarah is the resident Pettersson D500X wizard and troubleshooting expert. So, I know looks like Jenna Chapman had made a comment about an issue they're having with their microphone being stuck in the detector. So, Sarah, if you have any advice on that, feel free to comment
Gosh,
in there.
that might be a new one for me.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know if we've encountered that one before, but we can discuss it more later. Um, okay, I'm going to briefly talk about field maps and our data collection form. I think I'll just I won't go into great depth on this. I think probably most of you all are familiar with field maps or have used our data form in the past. There have been some updates that have been made. So I'll run through those so that there's enough time for Sarah to go through Audible Bats protocol info here. So, okay, let's see. I'm going to share the screen. Okay. Okay, so as I was mentioning, we use the Field Maps app, and there's a data form. Our map is in there, and our data form is in there. So we highly encourage folks to be using this over paper data sheets if at all possible. And so if you have, a phone or tablet that you can have this application downloaded to, and then download maps, that'll make collecting data fairly easy and seamless, and get the metadata that we need to accompany the call data. So, most of you work with agencies that have ArcGIS Online, AGOL account IDs. So, we can add your account, your AGOL ID to the map group so that you have access to the map. And so, yeah, you'll want to navigate to the Field Maps application, like it's shown here, and sign in with ArcGIS Online. And there we go. My screen was frozen there for a second. So obviously, you all don't have a Bat Hub account, but you have your own account. So you'll have your credentials to sign in, and you'll navigate to the NABat 2024 field map and data collection form. And in the appropriate group folder, which we will give you access to, there's a number of things you can do within this form. And again, I think I won't go quite as in depth as I originally thought. One thing that we are hoping to do for the future is to create some shorter recorded videos of walking you through things like the Field Maps data form, or like Sarah's troubleshooting of detectors, and make those accessible to everyone so that you're not necessarily having to fast forward through this, 1.5 to 2 hour training video to find the spot where we talked about, the Field Maps app, or et cetera. So anyway, I'm going to kind of go through this quickly so that Sarah can talk more about the Audible Bats protocol. But you'll have the option to toggle on and off sort of different land ownership or station locations within, and the survey form as well. There'll be, you can access the map legend and different symbology. Use the little indicator in the top right to find your location. And then you'll use the blue circle with the plus sign in it in the bottom right corner of the screen to add a new survey observation or new recording. That'll bring up a new survey form. So this is one thing that'll look a little bit different, is some of the symbology of the features. Most of you all will be going to green star resurvey locations. So these are locations that you've been surveying maybe for a number of years now. Those will look like green stars. Another symbol or feature that you all might be collecting is a new recording deployment location. So for folks who haven't been out deploying detectors, or maybe you're going to a new sample unit this year, you'll be establishing new locations. So you won't look for that green survey star. It'll actually be a new recording point. I think most of these other features are maybe relevant to our Bat Hub field crews. We offer them, potential sites and areas where we don't want them to resurvey because of access or ownership or whatever. So anyway, I think the most relevant symbols for you all will be the green resurvey star, and then the new recording deployment feature. And so again, many of you all are familiar with field maps, but just to kind of run through it, before you leave for your deployment or your stint in the field, you can download a map over Wi-Fi if possible, or a network that's strong enough. I know some of you all are out at field station locations that might not actually have great Wi-Fi, and sometimes that data connection actually works better than the Wi-Fi. But anyway, you'll tap the three dots to the right of the survey form or the map label, and you'll be able to add an offline area, and you can change there's different levels of detail within field maps. Neighborhood gives a pretty good spatial coverage with sufficient detail. But street or streets also works well. You can usually get a couple sample units within the street or streets level of detail. You want to be able to, place your bounding box over the areas where you're wanting to survey. And in some cases, you might need to download multiple maps, which you can do within field maps. If your survey area is too big, or you want to be able to capture, multiple regions with different sample units in it that you might be going to throughout the week, you can download separate maps, and then of course click download area and wait for your download to finish. Sometimes if this fails, oftentimes you actually need to create a smaller level of detail. So, going down to street, or if your download fails, try selecting a smaller area for download. That can be a common cause of download failure. So in your Field Maps app, you tap on your folder and on the map. Zoom in and out to look at your sample unit and to see where maybe those green resurvey stars are, or look at the sample unit to figure out maybe what features are on the landscape there during your desktop review, in order to establish a new survey site and then go out and ground truth the site. You want to make sure you're at your resurvey point, if you are at a resurvey point, to collect a new data form. Yes, and make sure your accuracy is less than 10 meters. Field maps won't actually even let you record or submit a data form if you don't have good enough accuracy. Okay, yeah, again, I mentioned the blue circle with the plus sign will help you select the new survey form, which will pop up. You want to make sure your location is actually where you're at. So, double check and make sure you're in the correct location. You don't want to move those crosshairs around, because it might add a point in a location where you're not actually currently intending to add the point. Take a photo of the site. I know I went into photos already, making sure that your detector and detection target are in your photo, or take 2 photos if needed. The data form will have some fields that are required, so you'll have to fill those out in order to submit the form. You want to make sure that your typed fields don't have a bunch of extra spaces and characters, and be consistent when entering information for each site. So even for, your biologist name, or the person who's deploying the site, fill out your name fully. Don't just put a couple of initials in there, so that we can actually know who to reach out to if we need to. The grits and CONUS fields should be automatically populated. And then, so the name of your site or station location is the sample unit ID, so your CONUS or GRITS number, depending on which NABat project you're affiliated with, plus the inner cardinal direction, which represents the quadrant that you're deploying within, and then a number to identify the specific detection target. So if you're resampling a location using an existing quad and quad number, if it's a new site, you'll use the next sequential number that's not yet existing in the site status layer. So, you know, an example of your site name would be, you know, for CONUS 118087, it'll be 118087 underscore northwest for northwest quad, and 1 indicating that this is there's one site you're resurveying at the same site. And so if you needed to move away from that site location to a new location because of access or the landscape has changed such that you need to create a new site, it would become 118087 underscore northwest 2. So helpful tidbit there. You want to provide good navigable directions to the site. You know, like in the case of this year, we had some partners who dropped some sites, and the Bat Hub is going to try and pick those sites up. So having instructions from our agency partners so that the Bat Hub can go out and deploy in the same way is super helpful. So, you know, just remembering that you might not always be the person who's redeploying a site in future years. So recording good instructions and good comments is super helpful. Many of you have descriptive names for your sites. So if you require a descriptive name, enter that into your site name. These fields are really important for maintaining data integrity. So use the manufacturer serial number on your detector. It can be found by opening the bottom CF card compartment on a Pettersson D500X detector. And it should be 5 digits for those detectors. I know SM4s have, and NABats also have serial numbers as well, so record those. Record CF card IDs so that we can match them up later. Like if you're sending us CF cards instead of an external hard drive in the future, you know, that'll help us make sure everything's aligned with the metadata. Start and end time should be recorded. We might have moved those to be auto-populated under, you know, standard recording settings. So if you're not using standard recording settings, then, you know, make sure you update the start and stop time if you've deviated from standard settings. You know, I went through all assessing clutter and clutter characteristics. So you'll need to assess that. And I know with clutter, it can be a little bit subjective, but just do the best you can based on the guidance that is in the field manual or that we just went through in the training. So you'll have to fill out some information about clutter. Detection targets, you can put in multiple detection targets. So you know, if you have a rock feature and a meadow, you can describe both of those features within the data form. And any additional comments that you think might be helpful for us to understand what happened during a survey recording time. So if a detector was deployed and it recorded data for half the night, but then died, and you choose to redeploy that detector, you know, those are comments that are just helpful to know. And then save your entry by tapping the check mark in the upper right-hand corner of the form and submit your data. And then you will need to sync your offline maps once you're back on Wi-Fi or have good data connectivity. And you'll do that by tapping on the 3 dots on the right of the map. and clicking on sync, and then you'll see it sort of thinking and syncing. Yes, only remove your offline maps after you are confident that your maps have synced. You can remove those areas to free up space in your tablet. Data transfer protocol. So there are a number of ways that you can transfer your data over to us. We do ask that you send us the data like as soon as you can. I know that folks get busy, and that data, you collect the data, it goes on a hard drive and it sits in a drawer for months. But if you can send it to us either via snail mail on an external hard drive that you have backed up yourself, a copy of that data, or you can try transferring the data via a box transfer, which I can set up for you. That can be a little slow. I know we had quite a number of people who were able to successfully transfer the data that way. So that is an option, and we can talk about that later in the summer. Just reach out to me. We can try and set up the digital transfer to make it a little easier. And when in doubt, of course, sending us the hard drives is still a solid option. And I think that's about it for, oh, I've got a slide in here about data folder structures. So, you know, if you've done a number of sample units and you're sending us all that data, if you could organize it on your hard drive, you know, by site, by grits number, CONUS, and then by your site names, that would be super helpful for us. So I think that's all on the data collection side of things now. So I'm going to stop sharing, and you know, as folks have questions about this, you can always reach out to me individually and walk you through some of this detail as well. So anyway, okay, I know we're running late on time. I'm sorry we're going over. That is completely my fault for rambling a little too long. But those of you who are interested in Audible Bats or will be conducting some Audible Bats surveys, Sarah is going to talk about that protocol now. And then we'll make a little bit of time for questions. And again, you can always follow up with me later as well if you can't stay on longer. So yes, take it away, Sarah.
Yeah, no problem. I promise not to ramble. But it may take me a second to get situated with sharing because I always have to figure out how to share my sound. It's a special thing. More settings. It is not currently app. No. That's not it. Okay, bear with me. I don't want to stop sharing. I want to change. Oh, include sound. There we go. Okay. All right. So, for today, I'm not going to get into the background of this project or why we're doing it. But if you are just generally curious, you can reach out to me or check out our website. The Audible Bats project does have a website that is easily Googleable. We're the only ones doing this kind of work right now. So let's get into it. So our two species of interest for the project are spotted and pallid bats. Spotted bats are generally considered a desert dwelling species, but they will occupy dry conifer forests and commute to high elevation meadows. The one habitat feature they seem to specifically require is a sheer cliff face for day roosting. They are highly mobile, solitary as far as we know, and echolocate at around 10 kilohertz, which is considerably lower than most other species and within the range of human hearing. There's a little asterisk on that, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. They fly high and are difficult to detect with standard passive acoustic detection settings. And I'm going to attempt to play a spotted bat call right now. Let me know if you don't hear anything. Okay. All right, so I'm assuming we all heard that, or at least enough of you heard that. If you didn't, you might not be able to do these surveys. So sorry. We do tend to lose our upper frequency hearing first as we age. So like kids think spotted bats are super loud, and a lot of adults can't hear them very well. Kind of depends on how well you've taken care of your hearing over the years. But with spotted bats, what we're listening for is that single sharp tick produced at semi-regular intervals. So it's their echolocation call. So when they're in, kind of search phase mode, you're hearing tick, 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 tick. Once they zoom in on something like an insect or an obstacle, the rate that those ticks are coming through increases, but it's still just always a single tick at a time. For our second species, that's pallid bats. They are often considered to be a desert bat, but can be found in dry forests, ag lands, and sometimes cool, moist valleys. Historically, they were known to occupy the Willamette here in Oregon. Um, Pallid bats echolocate at a high frequency that humans cannot hear. But they exhibit two behaviors that make them particularly interesting for this project. They don't rely as much on echolocation for hunting as do other bat species. They listen for the sounds of terrestrial arthropods moving across the ground to hunt them. So they're very quiet when they're hunting, or they can be. And then additionally, they produce low frequency directives or social calls that are close to 10 kilohertz. These social calls are audible to the human ear and very distinct from those spotted bat echolocation calls. And though pallid bats may produce these calls in a number of situations, the calls are likely to be far more consistent near maternity colonies as the mothers communicate with one another and their offspring. Maternity colonies are often found in sheer cliff faces, though they do also seem to really like man-made structures as well. The pallid bat call consists of 2 to 3 audible sharp clicks in a row, and we'll play that real quick. Yeah, so we heard a lot of cricket noise, and then those two little sharp ticks kind of in the middle, repeated a couple times, and that's what we're listening for with pallid bats. They are a little bit easier to miss than spotted bats, unfortunately. So as some of you may be aware, this did start out as a very small citizen science project in Central Oregon, just looking at spotted bats. And we do feel that the public engagement and education aspect of this project is really important. And so we are continuing to conduct citizen science surveys and appreciate any help from our partners in spreading the word with the community throughout Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. But the lion's share of data collection will be done by our field crews and any of you who are interested in participating. And rather than reinvent the wheel, we will be using the NABat framework for survey site selection with a focus on cliff and canyon features. Here's a range map for spotted bats that includes our spotted bat detections between 2016 and 2020. So as you can see, we're not recording spotted bats in the vast majority of what we presume is their habitat, which is part of the reason we began this project. But essentially any high priority NABat sample unit within this blue range or within the pallid bat range, which I'm going to show in just a moment, is a great place to conduct Audible Bats surveys. You don't need to sign up or register with me or anything. Just if you have the time and the motivation, going out and doing some listening surveys is fantastic and greatly appreciated. Here is the pallid bat range. So As you can see, there's a lot of overlap between the pallid bat and spotted bat ranges, which is part of the reason we're surveying for them simultaneously. We can see that we do a much better job of recording pallid bats throughout their range using the NABat passive acoustic protocol. And really what we're aiming to do in regards to pallid bats with this project is to start to locate some of their maternity colonies. So a lot of the literature suggests that pallid bats, if you're going to try to conserve them, you need to have different approaches for the males and the females. Females will be very choosy about where they establish maternity colonies. And in particular, it seems that they won't establish them if if there isn't a reliable water source nearby. So as we see shifts in the climate or in fire regimes in our more arid landscapes and some of those desert water resources start to dry up, we may see a shift in where pallid bats are establishing their maternity colonies, but unfortunately we don't have a lot of baseline data for that. So that's kind of what this project is aiming to do in regards to pallid bats. Yeah, so the surveys are pretty simple. They start after sunset. They involve sitting out and listening. Ideally, I would like for there to be 180 minutes of listening per sample unit. So this can be broken up in a few different ways that we'll get into in a few minutes. And there is going to be a data sheet that is already included in Field Maps with the NABat data sheet, so you don't need to like reach out and ask for that. It's already going to be there. If you are old school and still using paper data sheets, then reach out to me and I can set you up with a paper data sheet for this project. So the surveys begin at the end of civil twilight. Civil twilight is a measurement of the amount of light on the landscape. So essentially, we're just trying to make sure that it's starting to get considerably dark when our survey starts. I use timeanddate.com to calculate civil twilight for a given day. It's really convenient. And then just in case if people get out into the field and don't have service, this is a good thing to have printed off if you forgot to check what time civil twilight was going to end. So I need to add this to our Audible Bats website, but I will have it up there for easy reference. Okay, I've tried to build a lot of flexibility into the survey design for this project. One of the difficulties for these surveys lies with the disparity between the preferred replication per sample unit of 4 sites in 4 quads and crew size. So for a 2-person team that only has 1 night to conduct all 4 surveys, which is how it works for our crews, crew members will split up and head to different survey locations. After each listening for bats for 45 minutes, they will move to a second location and listen for another 45 minutes. This will largely depend on the terrain, the roads, and how many high-quality survey locations there are in a given sample unit. But at the least, they should be able to conduct 2 to 4 surveys in each sample unit that warrants an Audible Bats survey. So this image shows kind of like an ideal situation where there's a nice road going through multiple quads. In this hypothetical sample unit, the crew will drive out to that lower site. One technician gets dropped off. The other drives to a site in the northwest quad. They listen for 45 minutes. One of them walks to a second site, the other drives, and then, they get picked up and head back to camp. But that's not always how it's going to work. So if you had a crew of 4 people, then each one could just take a different site. Like in this case, they're kind of stuck on one side of this canyon, and everyone's just going to sit out and listen for 45 minutes simultaneously. And then we've got that 180 minutes. I know it says 90 minutes on the screen. That was my bad. We've got that 180 minutes of survey time happening all at once. And then, of course, some sample units won't have much in the way of good habitat. In these instances, biologists and techs are encouraged to make the call to only survey the areas that have cliffs or accessible ridge tops, and then they can hang out for those full 90 minutes and just listen there. So I do have 4 survey sites in all of my kind of high priority sample units for the season. Those will show up on field maps. Deciding whether or not a site is appropriate for a survey will be up to each field office. And actually, you're all encouraged to select entirely new sites if you know of or see better alternatives. It is shockingly difficult to figure out kind of the sheerness of a cliff face from just like satellite imagery. There's not a lot of really great layers for that. Something can look almost like a cliff on a topo map, and then you get there and it's really more of a hill, that sort of thing. So yeah, I trust in your local knowledge to kind of make some judgment calls on that front. With that being said, the tops of cliffs are our #1 priority for these surveys. The bottoms of cliffs are really good. Tops of ridges are great. And then desert water resources are also good sites to survey. If you're going to be doing multiple locations in a night and one of them is a cliff top and one of them is a water source, do the cliff top first and the water source second. That way you're kind of giving the bats that potential time to commute from their roost site to that water source. I have found pretty consistently that when I hear spotted bats at water sources, it is later in the evening. The field maps form is going to be pretty simple, and again, just kind of packaged in with the NABat form. If any of you did these surveys last year, we've changed things just a little bit. We've simplified a tad, but just like with NABat, you're gonna hit the blue plus. And then under 2024 Audible Bats survey form, you'll hit new feature. Yeah, grits and conus will auto-populate again. Pretty standard on all of these fields. We've got detection target. That's a simpler field here. You don't have a million choices. Just type in what kind of detection target you've got. You're going to put in the survey start time and the survey end time. Again, we're using military time for this. And then how it works for the 2 species, you'll register them kind of separately. So the first time you hear a spotted bat, you enter that time. You keep track as you go throughout the evening. And then I just want the time for the last spotted bat that you heard. So the way that I do this is every time I hear a spotted bat, I update that field to the current time. And then that way at the end of the survey, I know when I heard my last bat because I haven't updated it since then. But if you haven't done that and you're like, oh shoot, I forgot to fill out last spotted bat and my survey's over, you can just estimate. I'm not sure yet how I'm going to be using those time fields exactly in my modeling. And then you'll do the same thing for pallid bats. I filled it out 0 because honestly, most of the time you will not be hearing pallid bats. But if you do, I'm going to be super excited. Yeah, so that's kind of it for field maps. Just remember to hit the little check mark at the top and submit it once you have service. I do encourage you to get to your first site before dark, if at all possible, and take a site photo. If you're going between multiple sites, it's not reasonable to ask you to take a site photo in the dark, so don't worry too much about that. We will do what we can. Okay, and with that, I just want to play a few more calls for you guys because they can be a bit variable and sound different in different situations. And then we'll go ahead and wrap this up. So here we go. And I encourage you all to quiz yourselves as I go through. So I'll play the calls first and then tell you what you were hearing. All right, so that was a spotted bat. And that was a pallid bat. And there's that one little double click in the middle there. And again, that was a pallid bat. That was another spotted bat, and you could hear it kind of going a little slower at first, and then it sped up its rate of echolocation because it probably found a tasty moth, and then it slowed back down again. Yeah, so there are a couple of different pallid bat double clicks in there. You might notice that they sounded pretty different than the ones I've played earlier. Because this is like a social and communication call, they can vary quite a bit, but it is always a double or triple click. So that's how you know it's pallid. And outside of that double or triple, you often won't notice any kind of pattern. Right, that was another spotted bat with no background noise. There was a pallid bat. Okay, that one was a trick. There's no bats in that clip. I like to use that one to kind of test people. And then last one. And that's a just really robust spotted bat call right there. I will have all of these up on our YouTube by the end of the week. So if you want to familiarize yourself a little bit more with all of these calls, you are more than welcome to listen to those. Oops, nope, nope. Okay, hold on. Chaos. Nope, nope. Go to the next slide. Okay. Whew, sorry. So we've got a whole bunch of resources, me being one of them. Please don't hesitate to reach out. This project is my baby. It's my graduate research, and a big part of my job right now. So yeah, don't hesitate. We've got our YouTube channel, timeanddate.com, and then of course our website that has some information for you, and then also a bunch of information for our lovely volunteers. And actually we have our first volunteer event of the season this Friday at Smith Rock State Park here in Central Oregon. Yeah, so I won't ramble at you any longer.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
I will say some of those were a little quiet. I could kind of just barely hear them over the insect kind of sounds coming through my
Yeah.
speakers. I don't know if it was my settings. It looks like Jenna was able to hear them on her computer. So if you didn't hear those, definitely check out Sarah's project YouTube channel where she does have all of the training content, because those are, yeah, maybe the videos directly played on your computer. Maybe you'll be able to hear that.
Mhm.
Oh, and Jenna says she had headphones in, so that might have made a difference. That might have made a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, Rita shared a link to another site that she uses for looking at civil twilight times and such, and sun and moon data. For those of you, let's see, it's in the chat, but it looks like an official sort of US Navy site for looking at some of those details. Thank you for sharing that source. Yes, okay. I think that's it for all of the training materials that we have, which I realized was a lot. And kind of, as I was saying, my hope is that we can turn these into some smaller, more digestible videos that you can watch on your own time or just refer back to more easily. But we are recording this, so I'll be distributing that via email, in the next couple days. And so, okay, I think we can make time for some questions. And it looks like maybe there are some hands. Oh, Rita, you have your hand raised. So yeah, feel free to ask away.
First of all, thank you so much for doing this. This has been really helpful and I appreciate it. I have a couple of questions. I don't know, are you guys hearing me? Because everybody just froze on my screen. Are you hearing
Oh,
me?
I can
I hear
definitely
you.
hear you. I can hear you well.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, one first for Sarah. On the pallids, my understanding about pallids is that they only had audible calls when they had young for communicating with their young during maternity season. Is that true, or are they audible all the time? I thought it was
Yeah,
just when this particular calls when they had young. Is that correct or not?
yeah, I've actually read some kind of conflicting things on this. So I do think they're much, much more prone to um, making those social calls when they have young. But I have read about some instances where people are hearing them outside of that kind of maternity season. So I
Mhm.
think if they like happen upon other pallid bats while they're out and about, they may give a little chirp to try to figure out um, who they're talking to, and whether or not they're near one of their relatives, basically, because they do vary from colony to colony in how they communicate with one another. So the jury seems to still be out on that, but definitely if you're hearing a number of social calls, it seems to indicate that you are near a maternity colony.
So the other implication to that is, if we are surveying and I'm just wondering if we could potentially be missing some because if there's a narrow window of when they really are audible, I mean, I don't know.
Mm.
So, and then what about the males? Are they audible also?
Yeah, it's the males. I haven't gotten a distinct like yes or no on whether or not they're chatting with other pallets. Um, and really what I'm going to attempt to do with this data is do some modeling to see if we can find a relationship between the kind of frequency or consistency of these social calls and distance to a maternity colony. Um, so I may have like a second part of this project where I go out and try to do some like transect listening surveys to determine the kind of relationship between the rate of social calls and the distance to that maternity colony location. Um, so right now things are all a little squishy and I'm kind of trying to figure all of that out.
Okay, it looks like we have another question. Joshua Collette.
Hello, everyone. I'm a bit newer to bats, I guess. And I was just curious. I've done a lot of like little brown bats colonies surveys. You can hear a lot of their social calls and things. So there's a lot of other bats that you can hear their social calls, but it's the echolocation that we're actually able to hear in the pallid and spotted bats. So is that correct?
Uh, No. So, with spotted bats, we are listening for those echolocation calls. And certainly when you're in a roost, you can hear bats like chittering at each other, but you're not going to hear little browns making those social calls at a volume that you can hear while they're out flying around with any sort of consistency. And so that's kind of the idea behind this survey strategy. Um, I don't know, and maybe Beth can speak to that a little bit more about hearing other bats. But that's been my interpretation of.
Yeah, I would agree with you there, Sarah. And thank you for
Mm.
asking that question,
Mhm.
Joshua. Yeah, certainly can hear other bats, you know, out when they're foraging, you know, and but most of those other bats, their actual kind of search phase calls are just a higher frequency outside of our ability to hear them. The spotted bat is unique in that way. And then the pallid bat, social calls. So there are different types of calls. You know, there's search phase calls, and social calls and feeding buzzes and all of those. I won't go too deep into the weeds there, but those all sort of change depending on the environment and what the bat is actually doing. If it's foraging for insects or if it's trying to speak to or find its pup at a maternity roost, and those all take on different features, and you can see those features in the sonograms in NABat once we have the bat data plugged in. So yes, Brenda.
Hey guys, I do a grid in kind of on the volcanic plateau up in eastern Idaho, and I'm thinking about there's some cliff habitat there, basalt cliff habitat. So I'm thinking about doing an Audible survey this year, but it's grizzly bear country, so I'm not gonna go running around by myself.
Sure.
So would I go if there are two of us that are gonna sit down and do an Audible survey? Do I just survey for 22.5 minutes? Is that how it works, or?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think if you were going to be right next to each other, then I would love to have you do maybe 45 minutes and then walk to another site and do 45 minutes if you were comfortable with that.
Okay.
Yeah, that would kind of be my ideal. And then we're still just getting 90 minutes for that sample unit, but that's still valuable data. And so I certainly wouldn't ask you to like do 45 minutes walk, 45 minutes walk, and then, do that. So yeah, however you can fit it in so that you are being safe and still getting a survey done is makes me more than happy.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Okay. These are great questions. Does anyone else have a question? You know, feel free to raise your hand or, okay, Jenna, I think just raise her hand. Yeah, go ahead, Jenna. And if you are saying something we can't actually hear, or I'm not hearing you.
Yeah.
Even though it looks like your microphone is unmuted. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm kind of unrelated to the Audible Bats. I'm just kind of going back to the field maps form, and I was wondering if there's any benefit to creating our own project on NABat versus just going through you guys and doing it through the way that we did last year. I guess at what point do you like to encourage people to create their own like NABat account and create their own project on there? And what separation does that occur at?
Yeah, I guess that, I mean, really depends on your preference. You know, we can, like, if you're wanting to start your own NABat project and that be something that, you know, YTC manages, you're more than welcome to do that. Something that the Northwest Bat Hub offers to our partners is just like being able to put all of the data into one project. So that's a little bit easier to use for analysis and status and trends for the region. But, you know, Rita manages the Idaho NABat project in the NABat partner portal, and we have access to that to upload all of the vetted data, as well as the Fish and Wildlife Service refuges, Pacific One refuges. They have their own project as well, which we upload their data to, and that was kind of that was developed under sort of the terms of a formal agreement with them. And then we have kind of the Pacific Northwest project as a whole. The majority of the Pacific Northwest partner data goes into that. So that's currently where your data would be going, but certainly, you know, we can meet at some other time if you want to discuss. You know, I can help steer you in the right direction for setting up your own project and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that'll probably be.
And I don't
think
know.
it'd be meeting later down the line.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Just reach out to me. We can set something up.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Any other folks out there have any additional questions? You can raise your hand or just chime in. When in doubt, just reach out to us. I'm always available to answer your questions about this, as is Sarah, about Audible Bats or detector troubleshooting. I think this was mentioned in the chat and we maybe didn't go over it, but Nadia had a good comment and included a link to the SM4 firmware update. Wildlife Acoustics had sent out an email about that sometime in the last number of months. So definitely, regardless of what type of detector you're using, look into what firmware updates need to be made. But yeah, if there's no more questions, I think we can go ahead and wrap this up. I'm going to stop the recording and distribute that in the next couple of days. Thanks to everyone for attending. Please reach out with questions individually or even feedback. You know, if there's a way that would make this information more digestible for you in the future or easier to refer to, you know, we certainly want your feedback. So send your ideas our way if you have some. And yeah, if Bat Hub folks want to hang on in this meeting, then everyone else can go ahead and sign off. And thanks so much again for attending.